their own ruler country, they're essentially going into someone's house and trying to reorganize the house for themselves. They have no right to do this, and we don't see any reason why they should do this or they should be allowed to do this. There are clear problems of Saudi Arabia being in Yemen. The first is that there are clear effects on people in Yemen. The war in Yemen has been raging on for like 4 years now. The war in Yemen has affected millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people. The war in Yemen has destroyed the country, has destroyed the kind of infrastructure they have in Yemen. And Yemen is most likely going to be devastated by the effects of this war. And Yemen is most likely going to be devastated, is going to have to take a long time to restore themselves after this war has occurred. Secondly, there are also significant effects on the people within Saudi Arabia. When Saudi Arabia does this to Yemen, people within Saudi Arabia get the message that Saudi Arabia has ulterior motives rather than to just solely fix their own country, rather than to solely fix the quality of life in Saudi Arabia. What this does is it sends a message to the people in Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia is more interested in improving its stance as the leader of Islam, which includes their plight in Yemen. This is not exactly a message that we as Saudi Arabia would like to send to our people. The third thing is that there are significant effects to other Muslim countries as well. When other Muslim countries agreed to be part of the coalition to boycott Saudi Arabia and to not be allies with Saudi Arabia, a coalition led by to boycott Yemen, a coalition led by Saudi Arabia, but that what they have done is essentially made themselves an enemy of Yemen, but they have not consented to do this because they have been coerced by Saudi Arabia, who is arguably one of the most powerful Muslim states. So moving on to my second point, why the Hajj will help. The Hajj will help. The way in which boycotting the Hajj will work is that because it's an event of such cultural significance and importance to Muslim states and to Saudi Arabia is most likely to listen to this kind of threat and no other threat. The reason for this is that Saudi Arabia cares so dearly about its religion. Saudi Arabia cares most about what their outlook on Islam actually is. What Saudi Arabia's motive is to improve the quality of religion within their state, and without the Hajj, they are unable to do this. What they are most likely to do is they're most likely to listen to threats such as boycotting the Hajj. What are they most likely to do is listen to threats such as this, and this is why the only thing that we can do right now is boycott the Hajj, and therefore I'm proud to propose.
Sorry, is that, can I?
PM, are you still there? I missed it. Hello? Can anyone contact him? Okay, so apparently the speech is done. We call upon the leader of opposition.
Give me a second, please. Okay, I'll start now. To attempt to engage with OG's entire case, first, they didn't really give a real characterization of what Hajj actually is, right? So I'll give it. Hajj is essentially pilgrimage that many Muslim individuals perform at least for one time a year. And this is a very big deal within the religion itself. It's not just simply going on a trip and praising God. It is devoting a lot of their money, a lot of their time, a lot of their resources to fully immerse themselves into their religion and to actually, in a sense, self-actualize as a Muslim individual, right? Uchi has not characterized as well, and not actually put the full emphasis of what Hajj actually is. Hajj is to a typical Muslim and to Muslim states, right? So their whole case was talking about how Saudi Arabia will actually listen to these threats. I wouldn't actually be so sure. Yes, nobody will want to take this risk, right? Right now, hanging out with the bad guy. But the larger idea behind an informal boycott such as this is that, like, how are we gonna somehow isolate Saudi Arabia from the global world to actually make them do change, since Saudi Arabia is such an important tool in the world's economy and in the world's itself. They're not just going to stop immediately like this. And also, I don't believe in applying the blame on the shoulders of 1.6 billion Muslims around the world who seek to fulfill their religious duties, because it is the regime that has built and sustained that such a system has actually ensured that performing Hajj also means complicitly through the money spent and legitimacy that is brought by millions traveling to the holy land of Mecca. Still, at some point, we have to make a choice. Can performing an individual duty overrule our collective reason to exist, as, for example, as Muslim people? During some days of each year, like almost like maybe 1.6, like 2 million Muslims, men and women from all over the world, fly over to Mecca for the Hajj, often staying for a month or so. Pilgrims mix across the lines of ethnicity, nationality, sect, and gender that divide them in everyday life. They affirm a common identity by communally performing identical rituals and dressing in similar garments that emphasize their equality, that emphasize the strength of Islam. What does this bring? Feelings of unity within the worldwide Muslim community. And this is what Muslim majority states need to show with solidarity and unity amongst the current battle. And then my biggest argument will be talking about the spiritual significance it's for actually Muslims and how this will actually impact the unity of everything, right? The rituals of Hajj convey a number of profound meanings and deliver spiritual benefits to pilgrims. Believers obey the call of God by turning up in their millions at a time for a pilgrimage. The central aims of worship, exalting, glorifying, and praising God occur individually and collectively. The circling of the Mecca simulates the most common act of worship observed in the universe, where things orbit at a central point, an act common to electrons in an atom and stars in a planet in the cosmos. While God does not change, we change for the better by joining at the constant flow of life around in the Mecca. The main climax of the pilgrimage is when all the Muslims plan together. They gather at the same place at the same time to repent out their sins and actually seek forgiveness. Sincere pilgrims will rid of themselves of their sins and attain the sinless state of the newborn. The Hajj addresses one of the most enduring human weaknesses. The racism and tribalism of much religion is the foundation of intolerance. When Muslims all dress in the same simple white gowns, all worldly status disappears, right? During the Hajj, Muslims see countless Muslims from around the world. They truly appreciate that Islam is the universal religion that belongs to all humanity. Pilgrimage, in a sense, is a total human experience. The Hajj simulates the Day of Judgment, when believers gather in one place wearing only two-piece white garments, seeing millions of people worship one God at one place at one time, is a powerful testimony for the existence and the unity of God and the power of Islam and the joining of religion itself. Hajj helps to integrate the Muslim world, leading to the strengthening of global Islamic beliefs, a weakened attachment to local religious customs, and a sense of unity and equality with other people who are ordinarily separated in everyday life. But they're brought together with this thing. This is the biggest religion of unity they have, and only perform one for a few days and one time a year. Although the Hajj may help on the contrary, the notions of equality and harmony appear to extend to adherence to other religions as well. But at this moment, the Hajj is what we exactly need at this time to actually unify the Muslim nations, instead of just pushing everyone away from one another. And these results contrast sharply with the view that increased Islamic orthodoxy goes hand in hand with Islamic extremism that we actually see in Saudi Arabia today. Well, it's actually difficult to isolate what drives the impact of the Hajj. The evidence suggests and proves that exposure to Muslims from all around the world and the Hajj is important. It's actually important. And also a thing to actually note, despite the main argument that Hajj is related to religious freedom, is that first, yes, Saudi Arabia, we agree, has done incredibly horrendous things, but boycotting them would only anger them more, and it wouldn't actually stem to any positive influences. Spiritually, it is necessary for people to understand the consequences of the actions to engage in such discussions. But it is also important to note that the fact that such an important figure is actually echoed throughout these calls is a considerable importance and points to a wider shift in politics of the religious world. In addition, it's also important to note that, of course, it is crucial to point out how Western complicity, from the UK to even the US, has also played a considerable role in empowering the Saudi regime through special trade deals, diplomatic relations, and massive arms sales to the actual regime itself, and actually creates more harm towards Yemen. Like, for example, the UK is the second largest arms dealer and one of the most profitable relationships with Saudi Arabia. This means that the British government has also held accountable over the literal ammunition it provides to the crimes committed by the kingdom. This means also responsibility should be taken by them as well. It may seem that the task is considerable, and even that the monsters are undefeatable, but countless of people around the world are committed to the fight, whether because on religion or political conviction or both. This is not the time to actually pull away. British arms sold to Saudi, which were used on civilians on Yemen, was unlawful, but it is just one example. The achievements of activists and the continued unity is a crucial link to recognize between the government, religious institutions, and the most holy practices to not be disruptive, murderous, or reactionary politics towards this kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you, the speaker, for the speech. We call upon Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you can hear me. Just get my timer. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Before I go on to my extensions on my partner's points, let's take a look at opposition case, right? First claim they make is that it delivers some spiritual benefits to these pilgrims. Like it promotes like religious unity or something of that sort. Number one, we think that there are other alternatives for Muslim, like to actually get together to worship. There are other things that you can do to actually try and promote religious unity within these Muslim groups. We think that understanding Muslims and religious people are highly able to organize. We think that there will be other alternatives for them to get together and to other alternatives to the Hajj, right? Number two, I think the Hajj actually doesn't really promote religious unity, right? That's why we've seen historically fights between Shia and Saudi officers at the Hajj, which we think that the Hajj oftentimes turns out violent and doesn't promote religious unity. I'm going to talk about that later in my speech. And number three, we think that we can forego the Hajj a few times if it means the Saudis actually stopping their actions in Yemen. We think that this is a trade-off we are willing to take in this debate today. Now to address this second issue they've said about how it angers Saudi Arabia more, I'm going to address that later. And also, lastly, this claim that we can't punish like people for pursuing their plight, that there's zero analysis here, zero impact analysis. This point doesn't stand. Now let's move on to my extensions, right? Understand that the whole reason that there is literally a war in Yemen is because of the long-standing conflicts between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? The reason Saudi Arabia intervened in Yemen is because it fought, like there was some Iran-backed like militia that was like rebelling against the government. That is why Saudi Arabia intervened, right? I think that Saudi Arabia is literally using Yemen, the citizens, the people, the country of Yemen, who are all innocent, as a means, firstly, to harm Iran, And secondly, as a means to wage war and assert their dominance on Iran. We think that this is morally deplorable, morally abhorrent, to use this manipulation of other citizens and other countries in order to advance your own means while destroying the lives of others. Number of reasons here. Number one, innocence, right? The people in Yemen are innocent of any crimes against their Saudi Arabia. The literal only guilt that they have is pushing for better reform and believing in their religion. They are not morally culpable. They do not deserve to be punished. Number two, I think that humans are not a means to an end, right? That is to say, we cannot view citizens or countries, in this case, Yemen, the citizens inside them, as a means of achieving social change, or in this case, as a means of pushing against Iran, or like kind of pushing back against Iran, right? This is why we
Right.
don't, for example, view humans as storages of organs or as a means of production for a country in society, because at the end of the day, human life cannot be quantified. Human life is priceless, right? Because to quantify human life, to say certain humans' life have values and we can sacrifice these human lives in order to push for a common social change is a key violation to human dignity. That's why governments don't do things such as kill. That's why governments don't do things such as actively kill old people or disadvantaged people, even though these people don't really contribute to economies or things like that. Governments still don't kill these people because at the end of the day, we cannot view humans as a means to an end like Saudi Arabia does, right? Humans cannot be viewed
Point.
by actors such as Saudi Arabia as a means to an end in a seemingly never-ending conflict in Iran. I think that human dignity is a very important issue in this debate. I think that we cannot view humans as a means to an end. Third point here as to why it's morally wrong, right? This
Closing?
disproportionate harm, right? Even if you're not going to buy our argument on why human life cannot be quantified, we bring you the actual harm on these citizens in Yemen and why it's actually unjustified, right? You look at the fact that Yemen is often called the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. You look at all the airstrikes, the bombings with hundreds of thousands of people killed, the little kids without families, educations, parents, or love, the millions of people displaced, right? I think that this kind of pain done onto any country is never justified, is never right. No matter what crime they commit, it is still morally deplorable to subjugate others to this type of treatment. With that being
Why?
said, why is stopping the Hajj going to stop this from happening, right? If not fully, but to a lesser degree. As my partner has already told you, Saudi Arabia fashions itself as a leader of the Muslim world. That is to say, it presents itself as a leader of the Muslim world, and they are they present themselves as the most important and the home to all these Muslims, right? In order for this image to succeed, number one, they need people actually to go to pilgrims and the Mecca. We think that the fact that people no longer go undermines this image of Saudi Arabia. And since they hold this religion so important, we think that is an incredible incentive to pull out troops. Second reason they're going to actually stop like this war in Yemen, right? We have to note that Iran is so diametrically opposed to Saudi that Iran is going to capitalize on this and say that Saudi isn't actually the home. Saudi is going to view this as an immense threat and want to change. Saudi hates Iran so much that they will pull out troops in Iran. They will pull out troops of Yemen just so Iran can't reap this benefit. And the third reason it can actually lead to reform is because informal boycotts can lead to wider change, right? You always have to start somewhere. We think that informal boycotts, organizing large numbers of religious people, can turn into more formal religious movements, more formal democratic movements later down the line. We think that this is a good starting point for reform and change in Yemen. So we think that all of these like together, and this incentive is going to actually stop like this harm on morality. Second extension today, we think that this is incredibly dangerous for Muslim majorities in the actual pilgrimages in the Hajj itself, right? Understand that Saudi Arabia is an increasingly radical country, right? It's a country that goes to extremes to try to preserve their image. It's a country that goes to extremes to kind of quell rebellion inside the country, right? This is why we see so many killings, assassinations within Saudi Arabia itself. And number two, understand that religion itself is incredibly important to these Muslims, right? And it's to say they hold these beliefs very close to heart, are willing to fight for these beliefs, are willing to trek literally hundreds of miles to go on these pilgrimages. We think this very fact means people are likely to clash on things, right? As mentioned before, we see historically where Shia Muslims on like this pilgrimage in the Hajj clashed with Saudi Arabia officers, lots of death, lots of detriments. We think that this in itself is incredibly dangerous for Muslim majorities. What have we told you today, right? At opening government, we've explained to you, firstly, how Saudi Arabia will actually listen to like this boycott and how they will react to this boycott. Secondly, we've explained to you how Saudi Arabia has no rights, no jurisdiction, has no rights to intervene in the internal affairs of Yemen. Thirdly, we've explained to you why this change is so necessary because of the morality behind this. And fourthly, and lastly, we've explained to you how the Hajj itself is incredibly dangerous and should be discouraged for all Muslims. Very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for the speech. Now we call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the case of opening opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to start my speech right now. Speakers, government biggest assumption in today's debate is that Saudi Arabia will stop the war once Muslims stop going to the Hajj. So a lot of reasons why the war will never end, right? First, Saudi Arabia is currently a system of dictatorship where government interests are vastly different from. Should I restart my speech again?
I can hear.
It is.
Can I start it? Thanks. Okay. I will restart that. Okay, so government biggest assumption is Saudi Arabia will stop the war once the Muslim stop going to the Hajj, right? So several reasons why the war will never end despite whatever happening with the Hajj. First, Saudi Arabia is currently a system of dictatorship where government interests are vastly different from citizen interests. And the state is way too powerful to have to abide with its check and balances, which is citizens' pressure, right? So if their assumed outcome is the war will be stopped because citizens get angry and pressure government to stop the war, despite them not given this mechanism exactly, but just focusing on the outcome, we don't think this will happen. Secondly, Saudi Arabia government never really cares about religion and the harm that the war has on religion anyway when it comes to their religious reputation, right? They use religion as the shield to justify their war that was initiated for security, economy, and political purpose, which was already conceded by OG. The war, like we can see this very obviously by the war has been happening for years and years and has been escalating recently. But then like this. So we have already have proofs of and evidence that like despite years and years of sanctioning of international condemnation of WTO and like UNSC and all that towards Saudi Arabia, like there is nothing changed from their government. So if those practical harms are that insignificant for Saudi Arabian government, then we don't think that harming them basing on their religious reputation will have anything to do with changing government interests. And fourthly, and finally, we think that it is very possible for Saudi Arabia to take the war anyway. So there's no incentive for them to like stop the war and like stop their route to victory when the victory has already been very obvious to them, right? Because why? US has publicly announced that they will not interfere with the war. So the Yemen and the local region really don't have any strong enough force to serve as a check and balance to stabilize the region because US has already announced that they will not step into this war. Secondly, on the comparative, Saudi Arabia is a much stronger nation and a much like military advanced state compared to Yemen. So that is why we think that in the perspective of a dictatorship government, when the victory is already very obvious to you, and when the war has not been done because of religious purpose, but because of political purpose, there's really no incentive for you to stop the war, even when like the religion of and the reputation of the state is being harmed. So the entire case coming from government failed, right? But what do we tell you? On principle, we tell you that every single individuals in the status quo deserve the right to exercise their religion. Right? Because this literally is their rite of passage. It is like the journey for these Muslims to wipe like past sins and later and to start anew. All Muslims can do it only once in their life. So without this, a lot of Muslims will not feel as if their life are fulfilled or like they're not complete Muslims. So religious right in is a universal human right in principle, and whatever narrative that we're having needs to stay aligned with this very basic right? We think it is a very disproportional and unjustified punishment to put like the punishment based on citizens rather than government. Secondly, we tell you that Muslim states don't have the moral obligation to suppress their citizens' rights to exercise religion just because another Muslim states are being harmed. For example, if Cambodia is a communist and North Korea or like Vietnam is being invaded or whatever, Cambodians don't have the moral obligation to stop using Chinese products. Or if a Christian majority country like the US is being harmed, then it is not an obligation for other Christian majority states to stop going to church on Sunday. We think that there's really no moral, like reciprocal moral obligation just because like you stand from the same religion in the first place. But thirdly, we think it is a very unjustified punishment to Muslims, to Muslims within and without of Saudi Arabia, because majority of these are those who don't condone the war in the first place and don't support the war, and now their rite of passage and their journey to fulfill their life and their identity is being taken away just because of the government, which they never consent to. So we think that we should only punish, we should only punish Saudi Arabia government, right? Which is the jobs of governments around the world. So that is why we think it is unjustifiable to force and pressure innocent religious citizens in Saudi Arabia and other religious states to bear the consequences of the war that has really nothing to do with them and nothing to do with their voluntary decision. It is the responsibility of governments and of international organizations to like attack the government of Saudi Arabia or like have negotiation and whatnot. But this like is an abhorrent and unjustifiable punishment that you are putting on innocent religious citizens that have nothing to do with the war, and like there is really no practical like outcome coming out of that, which we have already tell you. But finally, why is this very harmful for Muslim majority to do this? Because when you look at why Saudi Arabia is attacking Yemen, because it sees Yemen as like an Iranian-controlled state and being perceived as a threat, you can see that Saudi Arabia never really have this Yemen war for religious reason in the first place, but the war was caused for economic and political reason. That is why we think that Muslim states need to have a more active and assertive stance on the issue and publicly declare that Saudi Arabia, whatever Saudi Arabia is doing, is unjustified and has nothing to do with their religion, right? In other words, Muslim states still need to engage with the Hajj because it shows a clear message that the war that the two countries are engaging in are a completely separated issue from the religion and has nothing to do with the religion. And they can do this most efficiently and most effectively by adopting two stands at the same time. They should like still perform the Hajj and can still be against the Saudi Arabia-Yemen war at the same time. And we think that shows and that delivers a very clear public message that we are still doing that, but at the same time we're still like opposing the war in Yemen, meaning that this does not stand for our entire religion as a whole, and this is a completely different issue. The fact that they engage in this war and that they stop going to the Hajj means that they already agree that the war happening in Yemen right now is because of their religion, and we don't think that like this is any like justifiable at all. That is why we and then that is why at the end of the day, religion is important. You need to note that religion is important for religious individuals and religious followers. Religion is not important for dictatorship governments. That is why we should never punish the wrong side, because like even when that punishment exists, nothing will change at both sides of the house. So proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for the speech. We call upon Member Goff to open the closing debate.
Thank you, dear. So in today's debate, we have a big crash point, which is more variable, stopping intervention in maintaining peace in one country or religious right of people. So before I move on to those explaining the crash point, I will revert to what the opening opposition side had said. What I want to mention first is that they said not doing hajj is like similar to banning Christians not going to their church, and this is not justifiable. However, the uniqueness of hajj is that people from various countries gather into Saudi Arabia to go to only place Mecca. So the outcome is that those people who travel to Saudi Arabia will definitely use money for travel and stay and for some like souvenir or things like that. So the difference is that it involves money, and this will be the most unique point for this is an interest for Saudi Arabia. So in this Muslim case, it's very different from other religious groups. And they also said that Saudi Arabia is dictatorship, so citizens will not listen to citizens are very different from them, so this will not have impact. However, even if it is true, they have another incentive. Citizens have another incentive to stop stop doing that, and this will be in my second point. And also they said that Saudi Arabia government should be punished, but those who wish to go to like Hajj should not be punished. However, if Saudi Arabia stops intervention into Yemen, then those people can go. So Muslim majority states, as an alternative, they should like work into the Saudi Arabia to stop war, and then those their citizens can also go to Mecca. So they have alternatives to going to war. So okay, I'll move on to the crash point. First, why religion is not as important as stopping war in Yemen. So the opposition side were talking about like unity, and that is what we need in current situation, but they couldn't prove why religion is not only the people's satisfaction. If people those people who'd like to do Hajj is not in the serious situation as people in Yemen does, so they only want to fulfill their wish to go to Hajj for their own interests. So, and they didn't prove why it is so important. And even if it is important, this Hajj will create harmful consequences, which is that I said that Saudi Arabia will get more benefit in economy. So those travelers will spend money on way to Mecca, and that's why Saudi Arabia can get more money for their own use, and this could be used as like intervention into Yemen, because the those outcome of Hajj will bring more like harmful than good in terms of finance. And by them stopping stopping conflict in Yemen is so important is because it may seem obvious, but it is a matter of life or death for Yemen people. So many Yemen people, as opening government side had said, suffer from famines, and many and many children die from hunger. And also this is so serious because Saudi Arabia doesn't stop that intervene into Yemen for their own political and economic interest. They only fear that Houthi group will expand, and that is the almost only reason why Saudi Arabia keeps attacking Yemen. And this is so unjustifiable since Saudi Arabia has no other good reason for depriving human rights of people in Yemen. And so okay, I'll take your point, opening opposition.
We told you that literally because the war is unjustifiable, that's why Muslim states need to separate the war from their religious reputation. Please engage with that.
Okay, so as I explained, religion, opposition side didn't explain why religion is important than humans' lives, because even if like religion is so religion is not so why Saudi Arabia continues to intervene in Yemen is because of their political and economic interests. So religion is only for citizens level. So yes, and that's why Saudi Arabian government won't stop. So to stop those intervention into Yemen, we should not allow people to go to Hajj until the intervention stop. So we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Hey, could I go to the toilet really quick?
Sure. Sure. Are you done? So we call upon the member of UP to open the case for closing opposition.
Hi, sorry, my Skype froze. Okay. Sorry. Chair, this debate wasn't about one or the other. It wasn't about an individual sort of right versus a collective obligation. And I think just by virtue of engagement, that's how we're going to win this debate. Because neither side wanted to talk about what the other side wanted. Because I think it's true that people in Yemen are actually suffering. I think it's true that there is a humanitarian crisis. But also we have to understand the characterization that yes, religion is extremely important to individuals. Side closing opposition is going to be the only bench to engage with both and tell you why exactly, regardless of like any sort of principle policy, this actually will not work to stop the war in Yemen being committed on behalf of Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to do for a few things. Engage with OG, engage with CG, and then I'm going to bring to an extension about why you worsen the harms and you lose all leverage that you previously had over Saudi Arabia. The first thing I'm going to do is engage with OG. So I think most of their case was just not contentious because I think every actor in this debate understands that it is bad that there's a war in Yemen happening. But what was actually contentious about their case? I think it was the sort of change mechanisms that they tried to bring to us that weren't exactly fleshed out. It was firstly the idea about cultural significance, which we don't think stands because largely the cultural that they want to talk about is not going to be affected in any large way with the individuals from outside your country choosing not to come anymore. I think oftentimes it's actually able to be exploited by the Saudi Arabian government to say that we're superior culturally, we're more godly than these individuals because we're actually, and I think it reflects badly on other actors as opposed to themselves. The second thing they tell us is then like, the idea that you are a leader of the Muslim world. And I think this is also ties into the thing that they talked about earlier, which is that if the Saudi Arabian leaders are able to point to the fact that no one is coming, they can therefore position themselves as the more holy Muslim country, for example, and therefore they're able to gain more political leverage. I think what was really lacking in their case was a way out, right? Because they say all sorts of things, but they also concede the fact that the whole mission of the war is to counteract Iran. So if this is really so important to them, they want to start a war over it. If they want to perpetuate a war for years and years, how significant is this whole culture thing going to impact that? We don't think that it actually is, because of the fact that the war against Iran is something that they entirely chose, I'll take one later, to engage with on their own. It's something that's of extreme ideological importance to them, but also the fact that they want to gain regional hegemony and that they see Iran as a threat to that. I think no matter what obstacles stand in their way, they're going to want to combat Iran, and because this is part of the Iran-Saudi theater, this means that all of the incentives they talk to you about don't really stand. Into OO then, I think that they kind of missed a conclusion or a link as to why, because of the fact that individuals have a right to religion, they said then therefore individuals should not be obligated. I think it's more of, yes, we do recognize that individuals have to sacrifice in some cases, but at the point at which this is ineffective, firstly on a utilitarian metric, it just doesn't make sense to have people sacrifice if there's no outcome. But secondly, it's just principally a just to do so because you have to buy the idea of self-defense, which is that these individuals oftentimes, unlike side CG says, it's actually extremely important to them. It's a matter of, will you go to hell or heaven? Will you be condemned to eternal damnation? I think oftentimes this is something that is extremely important to individuals. Into CG then. So I don't think they were very different, but they added a few nuances which we would like to engage with. So the first thing is that this idea of economic impact. We don't think it's going to be that big because you have to recognize that the Hajj lasts for about 4 days. If you wanted to put a chokehold on oil, maybe that would have a larger impact, but that's not exactly what they're proposing. On the other hand, even if it had some sort of economic impact, like we've told you previously, because of the fact that this is a battle for geopolitical significance, for them to position themselves as the rulers in the region and gain leverage, I think ultimately, whatever small, minuscule economic impact this has isn't going to affect these incentives in the long run. The second unique thing they told us, and I think this is the last of it, was about how religion cannot weigh out over lives. So the first thing we would say is that if you cannot determine whether these lives will be able to be saved or not, we would rather prioritize the thing that's just concrete, which is that individuals are able to self-actualize, they're able to self-identify, they're able to actually go through with the pillars of the religion that they stand for and which are crucial tenets of their life. But secondly, I think religion, like we've said before, is what makes life worth living for a lot of individuals. So you cannot exactly have a metric to determine what is more valuable in terms of someone's life or someone's perception of what their life is going to be like, because quality of life differs. And ultimately, we think this boils down to choice. If individuals choose not to do this, we think this is a choice that we should value. ultimately what additional problem that I had with all these sides in the debate is that there's just a lack of characterization, right, from government bench as to what this would look like, because they constantly talk about stopping the conflict. But what exactly does this look like? Does this look like a gradual pull-out, or will Saudi Arabia just suddenly stop the conflict altogether when the Hajj, like when countries don't go for the Hajj? I think this is just a really like convenient characterization that they did not flesh out at all. Into my extension then, why exactly will this harm the current situation and make it worse for individuals on the ground? The first thing we just want to do is talk about a bunch of incentives, because I think OO tried to do this, but they didn't really like flesh out a lot of incentives. They just gave you a few examples. The first reason is because it's popular among the populace.
Yeah.
We understand that yes, rebellion can work in some instances, but there's no like propensity for rebellion among individuals on the ground at the moment. The second thing we want to tell you is that the Hajj is like completely a minor thing in terms of the larger like religious scale of things. So in terms of things like Wahhabism, which it chooses to export, or Salafi Islam, I think these are things that are more important in terms of culture to them. The third thing that we want to say is that this is basically just all up to Trump, who is like who is integral in providing aid towards Saudi Arabia, who is basically all of this. Sorry, I can't take you. I have too much material. And is not inclined on removing that support anytime soon, despite bipartisan support. So even if you had a bunch of incentives, I think these are ultimately stronger because they are the bedrock upon the reason why Saudi Arabia chose to go to war in the first place, which I think was a large act. Okay, into why this is going to harm relations, is going to harm diplomatic negotiations. Because we have to recognize that there are currently channels for diplomatic negotiations between Muslim countries that are harmed at the point at which this is instituted. The Hajj is of extreme importance to individuals, and there's currently an overflow of people that are wanting to go. At the point at which governments say you cannot go, I think there's likely to be a large amount of political pushback, which is to say that the governments are going to be voted out next election, for example, because it's mandatory to be a good Muslim. I think there's going to be large amounts of backlash. If these states, therefore, do this, I think it also incites a large amount of retaliation by Saudi Arabia. Wants to position itself as authoritarian, wants to position itself as strong. It will threaten to either ban them permanently, which means that these individuals will never get a chance to actualize their religion, or secondly, it will institute things like sanctions, because this is an extreme economic powerhouse and is able to do so on small states like my country of Malaysia, which will suffer in the long term. This ultimately has detrimental outcomes, because when you're threatened with the prospect of sanctions, with bans, I think these governments are likely to fold to avoid being voted out next election. And ultimately, this shows Saudi Arabia that they have the leverage over these countries and they're able to exploit this, right? And the fact that Muslim countries have ultimately chosen the side of Saudi Arabia, means that they can never show support for Yemen in the public sphere. This is ultimately harmful, because now if you have diplomatic negotiations and channels, in the future you won't be able to have that. At the point at which you have antagonistic relations with Saudi Arabia, at the point at which you've lost their trust in you and you're not able to campaign for change, we would go with current activism, we would go with current diplomatic negotiations, because it does not impede upon the basic fundamental rights of individuals to self-actualize, and because it is the most effective form of pursuing change. We were the side that engaged with this debate. Go with side closing opposition.
Thank the speaker for the speech. We call upon government whip to close the government bench.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you are up.
Okay, I will start. We want to save innocent civilians affected by the conflicts. Hajj will just promote that conflict more, and we should stop it. Really glad to propose. In my speech, there are two key points. Firstly, Muslims won't be damaged by not doing Hajj, and secondly, economic impact is actually huge, and that can surely save some people. Okay, so first point. Opposition side said Muslims will lose identity by not doing Hajj, but in Islam, protection of life has the most important place among the basic values called religious necessities. Also, Islam has zakat, which means give money to people who are suffering or poor. So from seeing this, we can understand that Islam is really generous and kind religion. Considering from religious point of view, it is right not to go to Mecca in this case. So Muslims will never lose their identity or abandon their beliefs only because they didn't do Hajj, because rather they are obeying the principles of the religion by saving people in Yemen. Okay, next, second point. As opposition government already told, Hajj is supporting Saudi Arabia and promote it as a leader of Muslim world. However, this is a little bit rough and not specific explanation. So from closing government, we want to analyze how exactly hajj connects to promoting the conflict from financial aspect. So currently in Yemen, the UN had verified the death of at least 7,000 civilians by March 2020. And the actual number is said to be even higher. More than 12,000 civilians are killed by direct attacks. This is the second most lethal year of the war so far, noting that more people died from poor health or poverty due to the conflicts. So many children, innocent children in Yemen and battlefield and near area are struggling to survive. There are not enough medical facilities, and many people do not have access to adequate health care. Almost 18 million people do not have enough clean water. Crop and field are destroyed, so there are serious famine. The war has displaced more than 3 million people from their homes. What Saudi Arabia has done is evil, cruel, and unacceptable. All teams agree to this assumption. And how this helps Saudi Arabia? How Hajj helps Saudi Arabia? The annual pilgrimage of Muslim to Mecca is a massive business from Saudi Arabia. Millions of people visit Kaaba every year. Many people travel from other countries and from far countries, and trip could be as long as 1 week or even more. Considering that there are about 1.5 or 6 billion Muslims in the world, we can estimate that annual income from those visitors must be really, really huge. And the Hajj industry is one of the most valuable treasures of Saudi Arabia. That is a really huge resource. And it means that each time someone visits Mecca, it means each time people invest some amount of money to buy new weapon or to hire new soldier or to make new bomb or to kill innocent victims in Yemen. We should stop that flow of money into Saudi Arabia. So opposition side kept saying that economic impact must not be so big, but it is actually really big and really huge. As I already told, there are about 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. And imagine if the millions of people every year visit Saudi Arabia. That is a really huge resource for them. And when that revenue comes to Saudi Arabia's government, every time they can use that money for buying, for example, one weapon. One weapon can kill one innocent citizens. So, from the closing government, we are saying that even if it is a small amount of money, even small amount of money can kill one innocent people. But in this case, so huge amount of money will kill millions of more people. And that's why we are really glad to propose. And stopping pilgrimage will not only weaken Saudi Arabia's power in Muslim world, but also will decrease their resource to keep attacking Yemen. Even if stopping Hajj will not stop Saudi Arabia for intervening Yemen completely, at least that will lessen government's revenue and therefore decrease money for war. In that way, we can save some citizens, some innocent children. So from the closing government, we are showing the probability that that we can 100% save some innocent people. So opposition side always talked about the identity, but it is really unclear concept, and we don't know exactly how much that will affect our society. However, from the closing government, we are showing that we can surely save some people, some innocent children, some valuable lives. Okay, I will take your point.
Thanks. By cutting funding in 1 day only, do you think that Saudi Arabia really will have no money left, given that the US is buying arms and like buying oil from them?
Okay, As I said, the hajj industry is a really huge industry in Saudi Arabia. Of course, it is not more than oil, but it is almost the second or third source of Saudi Arabia's government, and it will surely lessen their revenue. And as I said, even if it is a small amount of money, even if we can save one life, it is already a huge success. But in this case, annual revenue is really huge, like millions of dollars or billions of dollars. How many weapons can be bought from this money? And how many people can be saved by cutting those revenue? So from the closing government, we are showing the perfect probability that we can save some innocent people, but opposition side have never showed clear impact. Therefore, we are really glad to propose. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for the speech. We call upon opposition whip to close the debate here.
Hi, give me a minute, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Chair, not only will we respond to all the things that the three houses in this debate talked about and neutralize all their harms or benefits, we will also prove to you why the situation will get ultimately worse on their world. Before I move on, let me just take down all three houses in this debate. When it comes to OG, they spent a lot of time telling us why the situation in Yemen is extremely bad, how people are suffering, how Saudi has been an extremely horrible actor, and how a lot of times these people have been coerced by the Saudi government. This is non-contentious, as we told you, and we think they spent way too much time on this uncontentious characterization. The second thing they say, and the only thing that was actually contentious, what they said was when they say that Saudi will be afraid that now when they lack the positioning when it comes to being the Muslim leader of the world, they're going to be afraid that Iran will capitalize on this leadership position. Can I just say how this is extremely untrue, simply because for the rest of the Muslim world, which is predominantly Sunni based, like they just cannot fathom is Iran being a leader to them, simply because Iran is Shia based, and these are people that antagonizing for their entire livelihoods, and just because of the indoctrination that they have had for years and years to come, I don't think Saudi is ever going to be afraid of Iran capitalizing on this position. Rather, it's going to be a more geopolitical thing, which we don't think involves a lot of Muslim majority countries outside of this. The last thing they say is that there's other alternatives for this worship. I think this is just extremely untrue, because it fails to deal with all the importance of Mecca or Medina or the Kaaba when it comes to these situations. There's just intrinsic value in these situations when it comes to all the historical past, and there is just no alternative or substitute, which is why Muslims spend and save up their whole lives, and in a lot of countries like mine, they give up parts of their salary every year to a trust fund, so eventually they can go to these places and fulfill their once in a lifetime pilgrimage. We don't think there's an alternative. We think OG is out of the debate simply because they can't prove to you what the incentive is for Saudi to ever stop the war, because we've already told you that there is just no incentive, and they're not afraid of losing their position, because they can brand other countries to be not being loyal to the Muslim faith simply because they're willing to forego the tradition that they've held so dearly in their hearts, but also because there's just going to be too much political backlash within those countries, which I'll explain later in our extension. When it comes to OO, they only tell you why individuals can't be battering rams, but we don't think they gave you they did a sufficient job in explaining how the situation will become worse. So at best, they just neutralize the situation to say, we can't change anything. We'll tell you specifically why you harm.
Sorry, I was disconnected.
Yeah, I think I was disconnected too. Where do you stop? Where do you hear me last? I paused my timer. Hello?
Yeah, the last time I heard you is about the neutralizing the situation.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I paused my timer at 3 minutes. Is that when you last heard me?
I think so.
Okay, cool. So we tell you how they will make. We tell you how the side of government makes things far worse on their world.
POI.
When it comes to the side of closing government, they tell you a lot about this thing about the economy, how this will cripple the economy of Saudi Arabia and make it a lot worse, because apparently the Hajj is just an extremely big part of their economy. We tell you just that statistically this isn't true, because the entire Hajj profit is only about 7 to 10% of the annual revenue of the Saudi Arabian GDP. Recognize that this characterization is extremely important, because the allyship between China and Saudi Arabia is becoming increasingly strong. And with China's power growing day by day and the eventual rise of the oil price, we think that Saudi Arabia has enough money and enough economic power to just sustain itself. Given China's growing influence, the closeness that the bond that they're constantly forging as allies, plus we think that the economic power or powerhouse that they are, being close friends to the US and constantly trading with them, all these things mean Saudi Arabia has enough economic sustainability. Recognize that they're just one of the richest countries in the world, and their natural resources are just the second most valuable in the entire world. We don't think that the Hajj just is enough of a role when it comes to them being able to forego an entire geopolitical war. We think that it was extremely naive of them to believe. They then say that it's the reason, even if the economic harm isn't that big, it's still worth it, because each dollar kills a person with that money, because eventually they assume that all this money goes to the war in Yemen. We think this is just extremely untrue, because you can't pick and choose which funds goes to Yemen. The Saudi Arabia just has a lot of money when it comes to dealing with the Yemen crisis. And a lot of times the resources comes from things like oil, comes from things like the US. But also recognize that this is a coalition effort. So even if Saudi Arabia doesn't have money, we still think that the US will ramp up its funding. The UK and other countries will still ramp up the funding, and the Yemen war will still continue. They need to explain to me why individuals should be willing to be the battering rams. But now let's go into our extension. I think this is just extremely important, because we prove to you how things will become worse and why this is just not a contentious or fair comparative. We told you that for a lot of Muslim majority countries, they currently have a lot of negotiating power when it comes to Saudi Arabia, because they're extremely good allies. For Saudi Arabia, generally prioritize countries which have a majority Sunni base, like countries like Malaysia. I think that the point at which you now sever your relation with Saudi Arabia simply because you show them and you antagonize them by saying that we're going to cut off the Hajj. We think that this is when Saudi Arabia becomes far more antagonizing and will react with a lot of bad things. So things like sanctions, things like cutting off trade, because recognize in a lot of situations Saudi Arabia isn't dependent on these countries, rather these countries are dependent on Saudi Arabia. A lot of developing Muslim majority countries like Malaysia, Indonesia severely rely on countries like China for a lot of aid, and China, guess what, is complete allies with Saudi Arabia. We think this is when the economy of these countries will not only be harmed, but also the people within these countries. We think the point at which they can't perform their Hajj and they know that their governments are making a decision, we think this is when the political backlash and the economic backlash will just be too much. This means that this isn't a sustainable tool, because these Muslim majority countries, assuming that we think that they just lose extreme amounts of support, and it isn't politically viable for them, because they're likely to just apologize to Saudi Arabia given the large amounts given the large amount of backlash, but also they're likely to withdraw from this entire antagonization. We think that not only does this harm the negotiating power between Saudi Arabia and these countries, because you lose the trust of Saudi Arabia and you lose the current loyalty that they have, just simply because you're a Sunni majority country, but it also is extremely short term because countries just can't take the political backlash and the economic backlash that comes with severing ties with Saudi Arabia, simply because of the role China plays and the role other countries play, but also recognize that the war in Yemen will simply not stop because Saudi Arabia wants to exert its power, and it's a coalition effort. Other countries will still continue the effort, proud to oppose.
Thank you everyone for these fine speeches. And then, so I'm going to deliberate the decision. So please wait for several minutes and then I'll give the decision.